How Daniel chapter 6 transcends into today's prophecy. The only way that the world could destroy the peoples of Abraham, the peoples in the Middle East, they had to find a fault against him and his God. Because without a fault, the hedge that God put around Abraham became an oath of promise and was part of the covenant made between Abraham and God. So this cannot be retracted unless there could be a fault created. Where I'm going with this? Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire and the nations out of the north decided we cannot find any faults. We got to create something that where we can make a decree that this man will alienate himself by falling for a trap. Falling for a trap. In other words, as long as the nations over there maintain the law of Moses and obey that law that God set in place for them, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Israel, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, on and on, all of them, Pakistan, who falls under the umbrella of the law and goes by the name of the seed of Abraham, there's no way that any nation can go there and take over this nation unless they could find faults concerning them and their God. Because as long as they maintain the status quo, which was under the umbrella of the law of Moses, the hedge cannot be broken down by any man. But if they cause the fall, the default, and bring in upon these peoples and pretending they are their friend, and they take on a law of democracy and abandon the law of Moses for the law of democracy, then they have deceived themselves out of fear of our grave. And once they abandon the law of Moses and for the law of democracy, then the hedge of protection God will remove. And that's when the slave slaughter comes. All of the things that were spoken of in Bible prophecy cannot go by America, regardless of his mighty weapons in the United and the rest of the world. They cannot use not one against them until they cause these to fall away first and abandon it. He have to find an accusation between him and his God. This is how God speaks to us. Well, how do they do this? How did they do this? Once Alexander the Great went in and destroyed the first part because of their transgression, they interbreeded in there, left with tares growing in with the wheat, leaving a man attached on to the seed of God, clone on the same as the angels defile the flesh, the human flesh, when the angels taken daughters of men and bear children unto them. In the same manner, every time they go in and tear down a wall, they replace the wall with a clone wall with part Abraham and part Gentiles, part Hebrew and part Gentiles. Hebrew mother, Gentile father, who had no covenant with God. Wheat one with the tail. Well, what Alexander the Great did began to build and create and build a trade network for sinners to me. This was going to be one of the greatest thorns that have been placed in the sight of each nation of the world. When man began to trade one resource for another resource of another land. This was the biggest mistake ever could be done, especially when you're using the price of money. I've seen this. Well, if God gave the seed of Abraham the fat of the earth, all the crude oil, then what more do you need? But what it did was, when they taken and create a resource, and they allowed them to enter their land and put embassies up on the Holy Land, they defiled the vessels of God because they brought the enemy inside the gate. When God had them to build the gate in the temple, the 12 gates to the city, the 12 gates became the 12 tribes of Israel. All of them had a part. If one defiled his dominion and bring the enemy in and let him set up an embassy in there, then it become an erosion, which will erode the whole kingdom of God. One bad apple would destroy the whole bushel. And time, through deception, this is what had happened. Once this is dead, then there would be something that as they spoke of in Daniel. The only way they could have got Daniel was they had to find something concerning him and his God against him. And this what they would do in order to tear him down, because Satan have no power. Well, once they built the World Trade Center, even today, they were looking in time to try to cause their people, through deception, to receive the blessings of Abraham. For God to turn all the crude oil, all of this, over to of Abraham to the world, so it could be placed and stored in the world market. So what they did caused these nations, the house of Abraham, to transgress and transgress. And when they transgressed, they became these nations eating off their fat, eating off their land, which was created by the crude oil. It doesn't matter how many nations America said that, and other nations said they was feeding at one time. The heartbeat of their industries and their employment equipment came to life by the way of crude oil. This is the way that we can't take this away. This is the truth. This is what people don't tell us. But this became a thorn in the side of God's people. This was a thorn of deception. Once they became rich with the money, which had no value because it had no life, no substance of life, they taken and created trade center buildings. They didn't place him where the natural resource was, but they placed him on of the have-nots, the one had nothing. They placed these trade center buildings in the land of the Gentiles, who was the enemy of God from the foundation of the earth. And to make sure that everything, nobody would, to protect these World Trade Organization, they created a Pentagon. This is the strategy for war. So all three buildings, according to the prophecy of God, became buildings of evil. It became the one that oppressed the world. It became the secret weapon of provocation. This is what it is. Because once they did this, then they didn't have no resources, but they had to set rules and regulations according to the law of democracy. And once they set these laws and everybody jumped